Okay, everybody, it's good to see you here. Pretty good in numbers, actually, bearing in mind it ain't exactly the most lovely day outside. Yet another nasty day in October 2024. Right, kicking off the talks, the winter talks in the GHC, third Sunday of the month, yeah. And to start with, we've got David Hassard here, who's going to give it a talk on Ralph Hooper. Ralph, I did know because basically the Kite 2B, which we're very much involved in, he was absolutely fundamental in basically changing that from the original Kite 2A, as they were subsequently called, that Slingersby built, to become this very special model called the 2B. Anyhow, I think maybe David will be talking about that. So, without further ado, pass you on to. Are we happy with the lights as like this, or do we want to turn it down to? Hang on. Ooh. How's that? That's better. That's better. Yeah. Okay. That's
better for me. Okay, thank you.
Well. Okay.
You don't need to see me. It's the last thing you need to do. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. I only knew Ralph in the last sort of 15 years of his very long life. But to me, he was a tall, gentle, modest, quintessential English gentleman with a dry sense of humour and a wicked sense of fun. And that's how I remember him. I actually got to know him because he was recommended to me as someone who would check out the life history I'd written of my father-in-law, who worked at Hawker's from 1936 for 40 years. And someone said, Ralph will check that out for you, because I wasn't at the time that knowledgeable about the Hawker Aircraft Company. And invited me round to his little cottage, and we had a great afternoon. And since then, I've known him on and off, although he's a very private man and refused any help right through to his last days, actually. So, I've got to find out where the buttons are for it. Okay. So right, his parents, Marjorie Spencer Tidderman and Herbert Ralph Hooper, were married in 1923. And I don't know if I pressed the wrong button. I can't see. No, okay, so I'll go back one. It's okay, it's just, perhaps it's gone off the bottom of the screen. It's gone off the bottom of the screen. I'll read it to you. So Ralph Spencer Hooper, the Ralph we're talking about, was born at Hornchurch in Essex in 1926. Note, Ralph was his father's middle name and Spencer was his mother's middle name. And the Spencer, with two S's, is carried through everybody in his mother's family, because they claim to be directly descended from the Elizabethan poet Edmund Spenser of Fairy Queen fame, or as Ralph would say, what a boring old stuff. In 1930, his father was a quite senior official in the Board of Trade, working on the ports and on the Thames, and they were living in Essex. And he got moved up to Hull. His job was moved up to the port at Hull. And so at the age of 34, the family moved to Hull. That's the youngest photograph I found in Ralph's photo albums of him. I'm not sure, he might be a little bit more than 8 there, but and right from the age he arrived there until he left school, right from 8 till a month before his 16th birthday, he went to this private school at Hull, which is still there and highly recognised as a rather good private school, Hymers College. I found his scrapbook. He let me go through his papers and things when he was in the care home at the end. He said, go in, gave me the key, go in, find what you like, and make sure I said, I want to make sure we get it into the archives at the Brooklands Museum, into the Hawker archives. And he said, well, just take whatever you like. And I found this 1938-9 scrapbook of his, and he had found photographs of virtually every British aircraft at the time, and he was 13. So he was pretty keen on airplanes from a very young age. I don't think you need me to recognise most of those for you. And he was already building model airplanes. I'm not sure about the Me Too, whether that was his own design or it looks more like a kit-built one actually at the bottom, but it was a big one, 42-inch span. And he was certainly designing his own, and this is one that he designed for himself with twin fins and quite a lot of dihedral. These are all rubber powered, of course. And he's already shooting up his very long legs. This distinguishing feature of Ralph. As you can see, because his sister's 11 months older than him. So there you go, and that's in their garden at Hull. Sheila took after her father. Her father was very keen on gardening, and it was all about gardening and fruit growing and all that sort of stuff, apart from his work at the Board of Trade. Ralph took after his mother, who was much more practical and did a lot of stuff around the house and that sort of thing. So it's interesting because Sheila ended up as a very senior botanist at Kew Gardens and is well recognised in Kew Gardens. So both of them were pretty bright, to say the least. In January 1942, just before his 16th birthday, Ralph decided that he needed to help the war effort, his words, and would not go on and do his sixth form at that college, but would take up an apprentice engineering workshop at the Blackburn Aircraft Company at Brough, alongside the Humber, as you probably know, near Hull. So he went down the right-hand line of these pages I'm just going to show you are from inside that brochure, because he kept it. Of course he did. So 2 years in various shops with day release and night school doing a national certificate, and then either 2 years if you're going into production, 2 years carrying on with higher national, or if you're going to be an engineer or in the drawing office, 2 years at University College, Hull University College, and then going into the Stressel drawing office. Well, he chose the right-hand route. Inside there are some interesting pictures of the factory. So you've got a lot of belt-driven milling machines and lathes. You've got Bothas bottom left, skewers bottom left, Bothas or top right, bombers. So it's dive bombers. But what you have got is a Tiger Moth there, which seems a bit out of place with Blackburn. But the reason was that Blackburn were refurbishing RAF Tiger Moths in a hangar over the other side of the airfield. And Ralph loved his time on the shop floor, his 2 years on the shop floor, and he seriously thought about staying on the shop floor as a craftsman because he enjoyed it so much. And the one he most enjoyed was working on the Tiger Moths over the other side. And to prove this, I've found in letters home to his parents this drawing he did of him working on a Tiger Moth. He says, "I'm there in between the two crosses." He said, "I'm in there, inside there, and what I'm working on is this thing on the bottom right, which is the dual control box." And he said, "I'm working on that inside the fuselage. You can't see me, Mum, but I'm there, and I love it." So there you go. And of course he kept his Blackburn Aircraft Company lapel badge proudly amongst all his other trophies. So as I say, from 42 to 44 he went to Hull Technical College, and then went on in 44 to 46 to University College Hull to do a diploma. They didn't issue degrees, they issued diplomas in aeronautics. And there are all sorts of photos in his photo albums. The Blackburn, this was titled The Blackburn Aeronauts, 1944, so this is the end of the, or actually I think just going to the Hull University College. And this is the facilities in the college brochure. Quite impressive, much more impressive than the technical college I went to. So you've got a complete test laboratory, top left, engineering tests, a physics laboratory top right. The bottom left is a radio workshop, and bottom right is a heat engines laboratory. So it's pretty good facilities, I think. Don't know about you, but it looks pretty good to me. And there they are with the staff. So Ralph is standing up third from the left in this first standing up row, always tall. You can always usually pick Ralph out because he's the tallest in most photographs. And then he went back into the drawing office and one of his chums said, they're starting up a College of Aeronautics at Cranfield. Do you want to apply? And they both applied and they both got in. So this is the opening day of the first ever course at the College of Aeronautics at Cranfield. And he was one of the students there. So this probably won't, will it? No, it doesn't show up on the screen. Anyway, he's there. And in amongst there is Bob Lickley. Bob Lickley had been at Hawkers as a stress man and right through the war, and left to go and do this. Later on, of course, went to Fairey with the Fairey Delta II and that sort of thing, and ended up back at Hawkers as a director. So interestingly, one of his tutors was a man he would know as a fellow director later in life. Right. I don't know what point they produced this little booklet, but it's a booklet about the first year course at Cranfield. I think it's probably towards the end of the first year, and it's really quite interesting. Ralph appears here, and it says Ralph Hooper, 21, studied aeronautics, Hull University College, and what you can't read is hobbies, remarkable aero models, incredible moustache.
Sorry, can I ask a silly question? Was he there as a tutor or as a pupil?
No, he was a pupil. He'd just finished it. He'd just done his equivalent of a degree at Hull, right. And he was going on to get a diploma, Cranfield diploma in aeronautics.
Okay, thank you.
And maybe this is one of the incredible models they were referring to. A very large tailplane. But he was always fiddling about with things, and this is certainly one of his own designed models. And at the bottom, is there any reason why this is overfilling the screen? Because you're missing the bottom of all the pictures, but never mind. We'll press on, unless anybody knows how to change that. The other side, on the facts side, is quite fun. It says that half the students were from the aircraft industry, a third were from the services, 70% of them still serving officers, and 10% were from research establishments. So he was in amongst a lot of older people doing second degrees, sort of MSc type degrees, as well as quite a lot of chums from Blackburn, I think.
Why did 18% of the students jump out of the first floor window?
I was just going to do that in a moment. You've spoilt my sequence. 30% of the industrial intake come from the same firm, which I believe was Blackburn, and most of them have got higher national certificates. The rest are graduates. 41% of them have already got a master's degree course or equivalent qualifications, being noted especially the naval engineers amongst them. The thing that I found quite fun is there's one wife to every 5 students. Under 13% of the students have jumped out of a first floor window, and approximately 2 teaspoons per student are missing from the refectory. So I don't know who produced this, but I imagine it's the Students' Union or equivalent. It's quite fun. Okay, let's press on. His final second year project was to design an aircraft to replace their Avro 19 low-wing twin that they used as a flying classroom, and to design a new aircraft that was better than the Avro 19 as a flying classroom. The Avro 19 was kitted out with all sort of equipment, so they could measure. They had dials in the cabin where they could look at the engine revs and the speeds and all sorts of stuff. And this is what they came up with, which was a high-wing twin-engined equivalent with better, more modern wing designs. Ralph did all the calculations. I've still got, well, we haven't, we've got them in the archive now. Got all his calculations on the speeds and weight distribution, centre of gravity, all sorts of stuff on the lift of the wings, and they did the whole thing. I mean, they've been through a complete aircraft design course. They knew how to design airplanes, so much so that this was accepted by Cranfield that they would build it as their next laboratory. They never did, but it was agreed that it was good enough for them to build. In the final year, these are not the actual aircraft, but of the type. In the final year, they set up a gliding school and went around cadging gliders from the RAF, and then making them flyable and flying them. So that was his first experience of meddling with gliders. You know, the college said, well, you can have a hangar and have a gliding school, but just help us get some gliders that are airworthy. And so that the dates there are the 22nd of March, 23rd of March for his B, and the 16th of June for his C. So there you go. Gliding certificate number 8071. And then he had to decide where he was going to go to work. And his decision was based on where's the best gliding club. Because he'd already got really, it had become his big hobby. He did play rugby at college as well, but his big hobby was gliding by now. And he chose the Surrey Gliding Club at Redhill. So it had to be somewhere near Surrey at Redhill. So he went to Vickers for an interview and Hawker's in Kingston. And he was actually interviewed by the chief designer, Sidney Cam, there in the striped suit. He said, very awkward interview, which is typical of everybody who was ever interviewed by Sidney Cam. He was a very awkward person. Sidney Cam offered him 5 shillings a week more than Vickers did, so he went there. And that's how he ended up at Hawker Aircraft. That's the Duke of Edinburgh, of course. So in 1948, he joined the experimental drawing office at Kingston. And at that time, it was still down in the original, Tom Sopwith's original Sopwith Aviation Company First World War factory down in the centre of Kingston. So just off the right of the picture is Kingston Railway Station. So that's the smaller oval there is the original 1912 Sopwith factory, a roller skating rink. And then the large island site was built through the First World War by 1916. And then the building on the far right of the larger oval, the flat-roofed 3-storey building there, was an experimental workshop they built in 1935 to build the first Hurricane in great secrecy. So that was where they built the prototype Hurricane in there, away from the main factory floor. Okay, so he was in, actually, next to that, backing onto the railway line, there's the whatever there are, 6 or 8 roofs there going across. He was upstairs in there in the drawing office when he first joined the company. But Hawker's had just bought back this First World War National Aircraft Factory at Ham, halfway between Richmond and Kingston, a mile north of the factory in Kingston, which Sopwith had leased from the government in 1918 to produce Snipes, and the government had promptly sold to Leyland Motors. And Leyland Motors have been in there building cars and Trojan lorries and stuff right through till 1948, but Hawker bought it back. And he would soon find himself working at this site at Ham. You'll see when, actually not for 10 years. So what they were building, Hawker's at that time, finishing off the 900 or more Sea Furies that were built, and the first prototype P1040 jet fighters, Sidney Cam's first jet aircraft. And he immediately does a 5-hour flight in a tutor at Dunstable, 4,000 feet and 50 kilometres in the Neon Olympia at Redhill. It wasn't the one, it's just a photograph I found. I'm not sure it was that, well, it wasn't that aircraft. And as a result of that, gets his silver. 234, July 1949. He's now grown a moustache. Well, no, he had it, didn't he, at the college? And he got a competitor's licence in 49 and 50. British Gliding Association under delegation from the Royal Aero Club. So there you go. Up at the factory at Ham, not down in the centre of Kingston, they were starting to build an order for Seahawks, which was the naval folding wing version of that prototype P1040 that we saw just now. And of course that turned into a very successful naval fighter and ground attack aircraft eventually. So that was a sort of era that he found himself amongst. But what he was working on was a swept wing, the first swept wing aircraft, and this is a scheme that was put out to the experimental drawing office. They were working on from the project office for a swept wing, T-tail, nose intake aeroplane. And they quickly went off the idea of a nose intake and went for the quite more practical, from their point of view, wing leading edge jet engine intakes. Still a T-tail on this. This is a wooden mock-up in the experimental shop, but it's beginning to look like a Hunter, isn't it? And Ralph's job, under supervision of his section leader, was to devise the way of fitting the wings to the aircraft. And he came up with the idea of a butterfly wing frame just behind the cockpit there, where the air intake is. Another one further back. And he actually drew it. I'm not sure this is exactly the frame, but I think it is. So a very sturdy fuselage section, a twin metal fuselage section, and then these outriggers going out onto which you'd attach the wing spars, going out round the air intakes. And he actually drew this thing and stressed it himself, took it to the stress office, and they said it's fine. He wasn't supposed to do the stressing, but that's Ralph. He would check something before he'd show it to anybody else, and he was a fully fledged mathematician and stressman. So he devised that, and the spar that went onto it. And he drew the main wing spar that went onto the front one of those butterfly frames. And a lot of weight, a lot of stress. So you can see awful lot of rivets and a lot of thickening plates, and obviously forging for the main Y bracket, and then going on towards sheet metal. So he did that, and then they said, well, we got this problem. The Hunter's made in sections, nose section, centre section with the engine in it, and a tail section. And it's made in those sections which have got to be joined together somehow or another. And we don't really like the idea of having lots of little access plates all the way round the rear fuselage to undo the bolts that are holding the two bolt heads together. And he thought about it and came back and said, just put a strap round it, make a groove and put a strap round with a single connector. And that's what they did, and every Hunter built since then has had a strap round the rear fuselage joint, rather than lots of separate access points for each bolt. So, he was always looking for the simplest solution. That was his aim in life, was the simplest solution is usually the best. It's the most difficult to find, it's usually the best, and it's always the lightest. And that's all you're interested in, really, in designing airplanes. So he did that, and he also then went on to design the tailplane. And there's the joint that we're talking about between the rear fuselage about to go on the prototype Hunter WB-188. So that's in the experimental shop. That is the prototype hunter being built with components, some of them, a few of them, designed by Ralph. And it is that year, 1951, when they get the use of Dunsfold. So they were out near Slough, at their airfield out there. They'd moved from Brooklands at the end of 1930s and into 1942, moved out to Langley at Slough, but that was a grass airfield, and they needed another factory, so they bought that factory back off of Layla Motors, and they've got the use of Dunsfold. So that was where they were flying from then on. And 1951, the prototype Hunter, and there it is, WB188. And the good news is that because we're chopping off the bottom of these slides, you can't see that I've just shown you a secret photograph. But it is. It's never been declassified. And there is Ralph in the cockpit of the Kite 2 and having a launch. You'll note that it's still got the hook on the nose. One of the modifications he was involved with was moving the hook back under the cockpit, or further back. I'm not quite sure where it is, you will know. Do we know this gentleman on the left? Somebody might, I'm not sure. Don't know. But that is Ralph in the cockpit doing what he loved doing most. He told me that his real hobbies were gliding and skiing. Gliding in the summer, skiing in the winter, skiing with all his gliding chums. So his only social circle was his gliding chums. He didn't socialise very much with his work chums or neighbours or anything. But we'll see a bit more about that. And here he is with the famous underwing. I've called them air brakes. Are they air brakes really? Yes? Okay. Well, he designed those. With Frank Irvin was one of the other owners. So they bought this aircraft. They got a donation from some charity to help, because they were trying to encourage people to buy gliders. They got a partial donation towards the cost of buying it, but they paid the rest of the money. I mean, they were young lads. I mean, he's still only whatever he is, 25. And he designed and built these air brakes with Frank Irvin, who was from Imperial College, of course. And he and Frank were great chums. And he built those at home, almost certainly with metal that he took from the factory. But, you know, his love of making things never stopped, really. And I thought this was quite an interesting picture. That is the 2B being towed along, and it looks as though someone's driving the car by walking alongside it. Steering the car by walking alongside it.
Where's that photo? Any idea?
I have no idea.
It looks like the North Ferry track.
It does.
Yeah.
It almost certainly here, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
That's before the freeze.
But nice picture, isn't it? And so now we've not just got the air brakes, we've got the fin extension down the fuselage, and presumably the hook as well, and quite a lot of other mods. I've given you the documents of all the mods and things he did, so you've got them here now. Okay. Are we familiar with the taxi? It's a completely stripped down taxi. There's no bodywork except the cab, but presumably it was for taking cables back and forth or whatever. Yeah. But I'm sorry, you can't see the bottom of the pictures on here. Okay, so that's Ralph in his element, and it's sunny too. But what he was working on at work was the Sweatwing Hunter, the supersonic Hunter. So that was, oh sorry, what I haven't said is they moved him to the project office. He said, you're not just a draftsman, you ought to be helping devise our next products. What should we be making next that's going to sell to the customers? So he moved to the project office, and he was working on the Sweatwing Hunter, but they never got an order for it. Unfortunately, it would have been quite a useful upgrade, but it was basically a new aeroplane. It looks like a Hunter, but probably wouldn't have lasted very long in service because there were other things coming through. So he went on to working on Mark II supersonic fighter projects in the Hawker project office with all sorts of configurations, shoulder wing and mid-wing and deltas and whatever. And these are actual drawings. These are company drawings in our archives at Brooklyn. And then he was working on the supersonic P1121, which was the one they decided they were going to go with. Rather than a Mark II aircraft, they were going to go with a supersonic interceptor, which could also possibly be adapted for ground attack. And then, of course, the dreaded 1957 Sandys white paper said there aren't going to be any more interceptors. We'll build the rest of the Lightnings, but apart from that, we're going to intercept all incoming military aircraft with ground-based missiles. So there won't be any more fighters, and we know that was a brilliant decision because we've still got some. We're still buying them. But anyway, that was it. So that was cancelled. But the company decided that it would, rather than as an interceptor, it would pursue this as a private venture, the P1121, as a ground attack aircraft. And they thought it would be such a good airplane that the RAF would have to have them. So that was spending their own money because they had no other project. They'd always made fighters. Right through from 1912, well, that's not quite true, from 1914, they'd always made fighters in the Sopwith Company before it was Hawker. So there was no future. So they had desperate to find their next product, absolutely desperate. In the meantime, there's lots of work for Hunters because Winston Churchill came back in as Prime Minister and said, we haven't got an Air Force. We desperately need Seahawks and Hunters and other things. And they had priority over all the materials. They could build as many jigs and things. There's 14 pairs of wings being made concurrently there, rather than normally you'd have one set of jigs to make a pair at a time. So they were desperately rushing out Hunters. In the very large factory at Ham, which was 8 acres covered factory, which was built in 20 weeks over the winter of 1917 as a government aircraft factory. And then, of course, the Hunter breaks the world speed record in 1953 at 727 miles an hour. So, they've got a good product there, but it's not going to last forever. Whatever are they going to do? And, of course, the Hunter had a much longer life than as an interceptor because, like nearly all of Sidney Cam's airplanes, it was rugged enough to become a ground attack aircraft as well, and a reconnaissance, multi-role really, all sorts of stuff. So these are some examples of different loads. The one unique thing, I expect you know, but right in the middle in front of the nose wheel leg there is a cartridge which has in it the 4 cannons. So you can take a cartridge out, lower it down and replace it with one that's already loaded up with new ammunition and fly off again. So it was, I don't think anybody else ever did that, but all Hunters were like that. And missiles, bombs, guided missiles, rockets, fuel tanks, whatever, hung around under Hunters. Still flying today in military roles, or albeit civil ones being used with the military. I mean, there's 12 up in Norfolk somewhere that are privately owned that are working with the Navy on pretending to be Russian aircraft coming in across the North Sea and that sort of thing, because they're fast enough to be a really useful kit. And there's a similar group out in America. So it's only 70 years later.
I believe it was working on the Hunter that meant that you worked very closely with the engine people, because initially when you fired the guns, the engines tended to stop.
There was a problem. Yeah, there was a big problem with the Avon. Actually, there was no problem with the Armstrong-Siddeley engine, which incidentally was a product of their own company. The Armstrong-Siddeley engine was part of Hawker-Siddeley, but the Rolls-Royce Avons were the first choice. And the Avons, they had all sorts of problems with stalling the engines when they fired the guns. Yeah, was an issue, but it wasn't a Hawker issue, it was a Rolls-Royce issue.
Yep.
And he could have some fun. He's at the back left there with the pointy hat on. There was quite a lot of partying in the 50s. And he started dating Sidney Cam's secretary, Sheila Quinlan. And this is a photograph I have of them. And he had of them. And he even went to Ireland with her to meet his family. Well, sorry, her family. And sadly, her family wouldn't let her marry him because he wasn't a Roman Catholic. And that was the end of his ambitions in that direction, and he remained a bachelor for the rest of his life, living by himself in a small cottage, and not spending any time there at the weekends, coming to Lasham. So there we go. It's very sad. He said she was the love of his life. Well, he told me. I shouldn't have told you that. That was confidential. At some stage, he had a Sunbeam Talbot 90, and he'd kept the brochure. This is probably late, although it's a 1952 4-1, he probably didn't have it till the late 50s. And he did go down and visit his mother and his father, who had moved down from Hull when the father retired to a cottage on the levels in Somerset. Small cottage, this cottage in fact, I think I've got a picture, yes. And he helped them refurbish that, and in fact he rebuilt the porch for one thing, personally, or built a porch, I think he said. I show you that because by now they've bought a Skylark 3, the group, and Ralph decides that in April 1957 that he's going to attempt for his gold badge by flying to Land's End. And he gets way down country, realises he's about to fly over his parents' cottage in Somerset, and circles around, sees his father in the garden and starts drawing his attention, but he couldn't draw his attention. Gets down too low to carry on, lands in a nearby field and spends the rest of the day with his parents. And of course they have to come and retrieve him, his chums. But so he never got his gold. But what he did do through the 50s is fly Tiger Moths at Fair Oaks, and a lot of, I don't know who owned it, but 9 hours in this particular Slingsby motor tutor. So he enjoyed powered flying as well. Is that here? Probably not, I don't know. But, you know, what you mostly find in his albums of photographs is pictures of him with his chums skiing, and there's a lot of these, so I'll skip through them. But so Hawker built a wooden mock-up of that P1121, now originally as a fighter, but now as a ground attack aircraft. And this is the mock-up in the experimental shop. And they were convinced they were going to sell that, but they couldn't. And they had to scrap it when the aircraft, sorry, it was, they had an order to make a prototype, 3 prototypes. And when the first prototype was, it varies in different reference books, but at least 40% built, probably more, the government cancelled the order even for the prototypes. So that was the end of their ambitions now to be into supersonic aircraft. What were they going to do? Ralph was looking for a demanding challenge. He was fed up with working on all these airplanes that nobody ordered. Sidney Cam had from Hooker at Bristol a brochure on a jet engine with a couple of nozzles on the front for short takeoff. And nobody else in the project, Sidney Cam had just left this lying around, and nobody else in the project office had got really interested in it. So Ralph picked it up and got interested in it and started to talk to his opposite number down at Bristol, who had designed this engine, Gordon Lewis. He was a project engineer at Bristol Siddeley Engines, at Bristol at that time. And they started working together almost without telling their bosses what they were doing, talking about using this thing. And because you couldn't tell Sidney Cam anything, you couldn't tell him what to do, but you could come up with a really good idea when you'd thought it through, which is what Ralph was going to do. Think it through and work this out. However, and this was the engine. So it's a Bristol Orpheus with a different engine's fan on the front. So it's basically a turboprop engine driving a fan on the front. Some of the air from which is diverted through those nozzles on either side to shorten takeoff runs. So he went and spoke to Gordon, and he came up with this idea, which Sidney Cam said, "We'll never sell those," and he was probably right. But Ralph was trying with a high angle of attack undercarriage. He was trying to make maximum use of the jet efflux at the back, as well as the short takeoff advantage of the swiveling propellers. So Ralph goes down to Gordon and says, "Can't we put a couple more nozzles on the back? That's what we need, 4 nozzles. That would be a lot easier." And Gordon kind of goes away and studies it for a few weeks and comes back and says, "Yeah, we probably could actually." And then Ralph says, "But I'm really worried about the centrifugal forces of an engine all rotating in one direction. So can you make the fan rotate the other way?" And Gordon says, "Not with an Orpheus, we can't." So they had to completely change the base engine to an Olympus, and came up, and Gordon came up with this engine. So you've now got counter-rotating shafts. So the main jet engine part is rotating one way, and the fan at the front is counter-rotating, and that balances out the centrifugal forces that are going to make it really difficult to handle. What they've also done is use the whole of the fan to provide air both for the front nozzles and for the jet engine. So rather than have 2 separate intakes, they've now got a single intake through the low pressure compressor, feeding the front nozzles and feeding the air into the high pressure compressor and into the combustion chambers. And then the front fan, of course, is turned by the low pressure turbines at the back. And makes quite interesting reading, although I just noticed it's in Fahrenheit. Can we convert? So the front nozzle puts 60% of the volume of air coming out of the front 2 nozzles and 40% out to the back. But the air out of the front nozzles is at 1,200 feet a minute, and the air out of the hot air out of the back is at 1,800 feet a minute. So it all balances out somehow or another. They've made it all balance up, so you've got the same force out of all 4 nozzles. And it's 230 F out of the front, despite the fact it's not heated, just by the compression. What's 230 F in centigrade? I don't know.
Pretty warm.
Still quite hot, over 100 degrees. And out the back is 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. So designing the back end was quite tricky. I mean, a lot of titanium and stuff went into trying to make those nozzles at the back put up with the amount of power and heat that was here. Very much more, of course, than was in the Seahawk, which also had bifurcated outlets to the engine. So that's what they came up with, and Ralph was away, wasn't he? And it didn't take very long. And this is his very first sketches of what an aeroplane would look like. So he's really keen, I've said before, on the simplest possible thing. So if you get the engine in the centre of gravity and have 4 nozzles either side of the centre of gravity, you can fly backwards like a conventional aeroplane, or you can take off vertically on the swiveled down nozzles. And that really is the concept which, without Ralph, would never have happened. No one else was going down this route. No one else ever did. And lots of people around the world tried to make, mostly in America and Russia and Germany, tried to make vertical takeoff aircraft, and none of them went into production apart from the Russian ones, which had individual vertical engines for takeoff and landing in addition to the thrust engine. And the Americans tried to make aircraft that took off on their tails, all sorts of stuff. Can't be simpler than this. I mean, the only additional things to a conventional fast jet were the air motors that drove, well, we'll see those in a moment actually, the air motors that drove the rotation of the nozzle. So you've only got the weight of the nozzles and some sort of balancing pipes and things, which you'll see in a moment. And this is the first ever, well, it's not, actually it's the second drawing. The early drawings had a conventional undercarriage, but he soon realised that we needed a bicycle undercarriage because of the jet efflux would be playing on the undercarriage efflux. So he ended up with bicycle undercarriage and stabilisers on the wingtips. Really, really simple. So the nozzle actuating system is simply an air motor driven by air off of the engine, no extra motors. There's only one power source in this aeroplane because it has to be simple. It's the jet engine. So he's bleeding air to drive air motors that are driving rotating shafts, which actually end up turning the nozzles with a bicycle chain. There's a bicycle chain right around the nozzle. Well, it isn't a bicycle chain, but it looks like one. It's a chain. So that's the nozzle actuating mechanism. Couldn't be simpler. All four move at the same time through the same angle because they're all linked together. And the pilot has one extra control in the cockpit. Otherwise, it's a conventional airplane, which is a nozzle angle lever beside the throttle lever. Everything else, even in the hover, is controlled from the stick and rudder. So it couldn't be simpler. He said, simple, simple, simple is rough. What you do need if you're hovering is a reaction control system. So he's got valves on the wingtips and at either end of the fuselage, and also behind the tail in the thing that leads out behind the tail, also sideways a rudder equivalent, sideways jets to balance for the rudder, for jets for fore and aft, nose and tail, and jets on the wingtip. And these automatically cut in when you get below a certain speed, and still controlled by the stick and rudder. So there's no extra controls for the pilot. It took them a long while to get the correct balance of the amount of stick movement for the amount of balance you need, and that was a big problem in the early days. But very soon they had what amounted to a prototype aircraft which could be converted into a military aircraft. Note the tucking away the bicycle undercarriage either end of the engine, a few other interesting things. Fuel tanks. The engine's upside down, by the way, so all the ancillaries are on the top because they might have been affected by the heat underneath. So all of that's on the top. And being Ralph, keep it simple and low weight, because weight was a key thing. I mean, the engine was only just about going to lift a bare airframe off the ground, the first aircraft. How do you get a low weight wing? Make a one-piece wing. No big brackets, no big forgings. So it's a one-piece bit wing right across the top, bolts on with 6 bolts, and you can take the engine out. I mean, it's brilliant. It seems obvious now, but it's brilliant. He told me he loved one-piece wings. He'd always admired them since the Mosquito. By 1958, they had knocked the front off of that First World War National Aircraft Factory and built themselves a decent head office for Hawker Siddeley Aviation, and or at the time Hawker Siddeley Aircraft, and a design office up on the top there. So so he would eventually move up there from being in the old-fashioned offices down in Kingston. He's still doing his skiing and having a lot of fun. And as I said earlier, In 1959, the work stopped on that prototype P1121. So it was that far built. And actually we now have these pieces, including that cockpit session. The Brooklands Museum have just got them from the RAF Reserve collection. And they're not on display yet, but we've managed to get them for the Brooklands Museum. That's the team in the project office who don't know what the devil they're going to do, except Ralph's got this nice little project going. And the company decides it will sponsor the production of one prototype. Luckily, Bristol Siddeley Engines have got some money from the, I always forget what it's called, the US Weapons Development Agency in Paris. And they've decided they will sponsor the building of prototype, what are now called Pegasus engines. So the Americans paid for the development of the prototype engine, and Hawker decided to build the prototype at their own cost. Ralph, as always, is at the back. He's never puts himself forward. I've never seen a picture with him at the front. He was a very retiring sort of person and very self-effacing, and he always said no one person achieves anything, you know, it's a team. But without his genius I don't think this would have ever happened. And that's the prototype being built in the experimental shop at Kingston, known as the P1127 at this time, and very soon they're testing out the balancing mechanism in hovering. They didn't bother to fly it. They decided it's all about getting the hover right. And you'll notice there's cables all over the place. And Hawker, being extremely miserly with their expenditure on anything, the cables every 6 foot or so had sandbags on them or weights on them. So if it got any higher, it had to lift the weight of a few bags. If it got any higher again, and that was the way they kept it tethered to the ground in case it ran away. They were worried about it running away. They were really worried about the controls being too coarse, you know, onto the nozzles on the wingtip. And that's Bill Bedford in there with his broken leg, famously. Had to get a special certificate to hover an aircraft but not fly it because he had a broken leg. He'd broken it in a motorcycle accident or car accident the day before. And I quite like this picture because that's Ralph with his long coat and his hands in his pocket, wondering what the devil they're going to do about this problem that it bouncing when it lands. They were getting a lot of bounce when they landed, and they were trying all sorts of different ideas with these tipped wheels. A bit of Meccano sort of looking stuff. It isn't, but they did get it sorted out, and in the end Doughty designed a special undercarriage with dampers in it which wouldn't rebound. Yeah. And by November 60 they're doing untethered vertical takeoffs and hovers, and the Americans have offered to do a free flight wind tunnel model in their big free flight wind tunnel at NASA at Langley. And this was another one of Ralph's people he always mentioned, Marion McKinney. He said you couldn't want for a nicer guy, a more helpful guy. And he got in touch with Marion, and Marion, without any permission from anybody else, set up their wind tunnel with a free flying model. I forget what scale it is, 16th I think. So you've got someone on the right on the power, fed to the nozzles. You've got a pitch pilot, a roll pilot in a little plastic box down there, and a yaw pilot up the top. So you've got 3 pilots and someone controlling the power. And what they're attempting to do is prove that it's possible to go from a transition in hover to forward flight. And they're trying to show Ralph that, or trying to prove to Ralph, or he's trying to prove to everybody else, that it is possible to transition from a hover to forward flight with this system. And it's hugely successful, and it gives them great confidence to go ahead with transitions. And in September 1961 they celebrate after making the first transition from hover into forward flight. And Ralph's there somewhere, or just underneath the cockpit. What Ralph's been working on with all this in the background, this little prototype thing, is the supersonic version. And Bristol Siddeley engines are working on an engine with a plenum chamber burning. So what they're planning to do is burn fuel in those front nozzles to increase the power of the engine for supersonic flight. The equivalent of an afterburner, really, but to do it in the front nozzles. And this is the 1154. It wins the NATO competition for the NATO standard interceptor aircraft, but NATO doesn't buy airplanes, and no other country was going to, especially not the French, were going to buy a British designed airplane. The Navy, the government says, well, okay, but the Navy and the RAF could probably have them, providing it's the same airplane, which was a disaster, because the Navy wanted a 2-seat ground attack aircraft and the RAF wanted a single-seat interceptor, and the two could not be met. The Navy anyway had decided they wanted Phantoms and found every reason for not buying this, and in the end the whole thing got cancelled anyway, and they were left without a supersonic project. So the Navy bought Phantoms, and so did the RAF, of course, eventually, but they bought F-111s instead of this, and they were useless. I mean, they never put them in service, did they, the F-111s? So they ended up with Phantoms as well, with a Rolls. Well, I'm not going to go into that story, it makes me angry. And then, oh, you can't read that, but at this point, in 1962, Ralph was promoted as Chief Designer Projects. So they now recognise he was the guy to lead the forward projects, whatever the company was going to do next. Now all they had at the moment was a prototype, what became a Harrier being built. And he bought himself an Alpine GT for £998. I got the bill. So it's very much his thing for dashing down here at the weekends. And then Bill Bedford, of course, makes the first ever vertical landing on an aircraft carrier in February '63. Sorry, I'm going on a bit. I must race on. I haven't got too much more. And that's successful enough that the government decides that there'll be a tripartite evaluation squadron, Germany, America and Britain, flying 9 of these Kestrels, a fleet of Kestrels, testing out whether this thing has actually got any military uses. And they did that up in Norfolk and felt it was an extremely useful piece of kit, because if you've, not least for, if someone attacks you like the Israelis did in Egypt and knocks out your runways, how the hell are you going to fly your nice airplanes? But you can have these things parked in a wood overnight, flying off a road, and always defend yourself in future. And that's exactly what happened. So the Kestrel Evaluations Squadron worked out of woods and on public roads, and landing and taking off on grass as well. I mean, quite extraordinary stuff they did. And that's the team when they were so successful that Hawker got an order for 9 pre-production aircraft, still not called Harriers, but they would be Harriers. So that's the German, American and British people and the team at the back, the Hawker team. And Ralph buys 400 5-shilling shares in the Lash and Gliding Society. Like you do. So I've already covered that, but it was 65 by the time they cancelled the supersonic fighter. The prototype 1127 had been built, the 9 Kestrels had been successful, and so they decide they will go ahead with a fully equipped military version of the Kestrel. It didn't have military equipment. It had military radio and communications, but didn't have military fittings. And the first pre-production Harriers came out in 1966, and the RAF ordered 77. And by that time, Ralph's team were devising the 2-seat trainer version. Again, as simple as possible. How simple can you make it? So it's all the same components except for the blue bits. So they extended the height of the fin by a bottom bit of fin, extended the length of the tail to balance out the extra length of the front fuselage. It needed a strake under the rear fuselage, two-seat cockpit and a different radar in the nose, but otherwise identical aeroplane. They weren't ever going to build very many. I mean, there were only going to be a few needed for training Harrier pilots. And in the American Helicopter Society awards awards the company for a significant contribution to the development of VTOL aircraft. So that's their award, was Ralph smiling away. And through 67, 68, Ralph starts flying Condors down at Fair Oaks. It just happened to be in his logbook, which is quite interesting. Not that particular one, but that is a Condor. Rollison built, of course, in Croydon. And in 1968, he's promoted to chief engineer and becomes a director of the company. And this is now, of course, Hawker Siddeley Aviation rather than Hawker Siddeley Aircraft. So this is Hawker Siddeley Aviation because they've now bought de Havilland and Blackburn and Folland and a few other companies. So it's a really big aviation group. And then he goes into hospital. So it's a bit non-new these days, isn't it? But lots of cartoons were done around the factory. They had some good people who were writing brochures and doing all sorts of technical illustration. But it says up there, vertical takeoffs should only be made from areas which are free of doctors, nurses and other loose objects. And at the bottom it says, matron to RH1, report to the MO on landing. So this is his chums taking the mickey. But he never flew again. There's nothing in any of his logbooks after 1968 of flying gliders or fixed wing, which is quite interesting. I never quite worked out what the problem was. So 1969, Harriers enter RAF service, and like the Hunter before them, can carry all sorts of stores and supplies. And of course, famously won the race, the 50th anniversary crossing of the first Atlantic race from London to New York by flying from the coal yard at St Pancras Station and landing on the dockside in New York, beating the Phantoms and everybody else who had to land much further out, you know, because it was from the top of the post office tower to the top of the Empire State Building, and they took off really close to both, and with lots of refueling across the Atlantic, of course. But it was a wonderful advertisement for the RAF's new aircraft, winning that major prize. It was in all the papers and everything.
There's a huge cloud of coal dust came up.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. And by now, this factory, which was building Sopwith Snipes in the First World War and Hunters just recently, is full of hand-built Harriers, and they operate in remote sites with no big airfields. In Germany, virtually every night through the Cold War, there was a dispersed squadron somewhere, or part squadron somewhere. And in Belize, they operate without airfields and just covered in protective nets to protect, or camouflage nets to protect Belize from its neighbour. I think was it Guatemala? I can't remember. Someone was planning to invade them. In 1971, all the suppliers, engines, instruments, everybody else, all the suppliers get together with Hawker and pay for the building of a demonstrator, which was registered GVTOL. And those of you who ever go to Brooklands will know it's in the flight shed at Brooklands, and you can climb in the cockpit when you go there, usually, if there's some volunteers on hand. So GVTOL still exists, and Ralph's there, of course, somewhere. And that's taken out all around the world on sales tours, mostly by John Farley, but by others as well. So obviously in South America, actually, they don't sell very many, strangely. But finally, Ralph on the right here gets to fly in his own Harrier. And I really wish I'd asked him about that flight, but I'm sure he would have been at the controls some of the time, if not most of the time. So he did get to fly in the Harrier once. There was a 2-seat civil one. He wasn't allowed to fly in the RAF ones because they belonged to the RAF. Okay, amazingly, in 1971, the US Marines order 110 Harriers straight from the factory in Kingston, no US manufacturer at all. The Americans don't buy frontline military equipment from foreign companies, but the Marines were absolutely insistent that they got Harriers because they could fly them from their helicopter small ships. They could land them without airfields if they were working with small events around the world. And that was the start of the US Marine Corps' involvement in Harriers. That's leaving on a Queen Mary outside the factory in Kingston, about to go down to Dunsfold. And it's complete. Everything's there. The whole cockpit, everything's kitted out. It's 6 bolts for the wing, the tailplane and rudder to be put on, and all the pipes and cables connected up for the for the wingtip valves and things. But otherwise, I mean, it's not much work to make that into an all-flying airplane. So it was all done at the factory in Kingston. Ralph accepts the Coachmakers Award for the Harrier on behalf of the company, and then personally gets the Royal Society Medal for Inventors. So people are beginning to recognise his part in all this, and obviously wants to be at the 21st anniversary of the first flight of the Hunter. And there he is right underneath the cockpit, I think the tallest person yet again. And what his team are now devising is the Hawk Advanced Jet Trainer. And some of these people have come up from Folland, who were people who'd worked on the Gnat, because the company now owned Folland. And they were working away on the Hawk. And again, Ralph, lots of people have told me, Ralph, although he was the boss, you know, the chief designer, he took a great deal of interest in this. And once again, insisted, one, on a larger engine, so it was to replace the Jet Provost. And the RAF said, we just want the same engine, we just want a better airplane. And Ralph insisted on having a more powerful engine, albeit partially French or original French design, because he said, you know, we've got to have a different product than what everybody else is making, and it's got to fly better. And by the way, it's got to be able to be used in anger. If you're going to train people, because it's for training people in flying a military aircraft, not elementary pilot training, this is for training people to be a fighter pilot or a ground attack pilot, then this thing ought to be able to carry all the bombs and weapons, in which case small air forces can use it as their ground attack aircraft as well as their trainer. And that was his insistence. Plus, oh, you won't be surprised, a single piece wing. These are the sort of influences he had on the design, the size of the engine and the single piece wing and a few other things. And of course, very, very soon after, they've got a complete aircraft designed. I must press on. Ralph gets a silver medal from the Royal Aeronautical Society for practical achievement leading to the advancement in aeronautics, and goes off skiing again. And skiing again. And by 1974, the company has got a contract to build Hawks without a prototype. The RAF said, we can't really afford it, it's more expensive than we were expecting. And they said, okay, forget any contract to make any prototypes, we'll go straight into production and we'll take the risk that it will be a good flying airplane as straight off the production line, because we know how to design and build airplanes. And that's what they did. These are the first 3 coming off the production line. What they did do is say, but you've got to tell us how you're going to judge it's a good airplane. You know, maintainability, downtime, all sorts of other stuff, not just performance. And we'll have a bonus if we beat any of those. They made no money on building the first batch of Hawks, but they made a lot of money out of its reliability and low maintenance costs and availability. So they made profit, but by cleverly wording the contract the right way. Oh, sorry. And there they are. So it's one there with a gun pod underneath, rockets, whatever. And we all know them, don't we? Ralph's team, though, are looking at naval use of Harriers as the Sea Harrier, and this is what Britain's first true multi-role combat aircraft. So it can reconnoitre 20 square miles of sea with its radar pods and that sort of thing. It can be a ground attack aircraft carrying bombs and rockets, or what's the other thing? I've forgotten. Oh, it's an interceptor, a high altitude interceptor. Yeah. So it does all three. It's amazing move forward from the Harrier. A cockpit set higher up for deck landing. A nice picture of Bill Bedford and John Farley with Ralph on the right. I think the two perhaps most famous of Hawker's test pilots. So under the tail of a Harrier, of course. And a completely different company with Lord Beswick, who was taking over British Aerospace as the chairman of British Aerospace, going round the factory, looking very serious. He didn't get on at all with Beswick. And that was when they heard that the aircraft industry was going to be nationalised. So Hawker Siddeley was nationalised. Nothing much changed in the factory apart from the board outside here being seen to change. The good old boys carried on for a while until Hawker Siddeley got there, until British Aerospace got a bit too big for their boots. What a lovely circular story we have to tell, because he became divisional director of the Kingston Brough division where he'd done his apprenticeship. So he was divisional technical director of British Aerospace for Kingston and Brough. So it's quite a nice rounding off, isn't it? I'm nearly finished. So in 1978 he got the OBE. There he is with his mother and his little sister, and having a laugh, putting his hat back on the back of his head and showing off his OBE. He obviously was quite fun in the office because his secretaries said, "Congratulations, Master, on your OBE from your serfs," behind her head there, and the other side of the thing says, "OBEs treat their secretaries better." And they did. The only casual picture I've ever seen of him in his work, but obviously at his desk with a glass of wine and his feet up on that day when he came back from getting his OBE. As I say, the Sea Harriers went into service in '78, and here's one on Hermes, and a rather nice picture of one taking off. And we all know that. I don't think we'd even attempted to recover the Falklands Islands without the Harriers. I think it was a key element in the decision to go back down there. And of course the GR3s by now, the RAF GR3s and the Sea Harriers are incredibly important in downing quite a lot of the Argentine aircraft, taking down some missiles, and also in ground attack helping the army. And none of them got shot down by an Argentine aircraft. There were some crashes, but none of them got shot down. And of course, in December that year, Maggie Thatcher has to come to Kingston, doesn't she, and congratulate everybody, and the first person she's introduced to is Ralph. It seems that they had quite a few laughs. They seemed to be smiling. And Ralph took her to see the full-size mock-up of their supersonic Stovall aircraft, the P-1216. And he was convinced, well, everybody at Kingston was convinced this was the future. So this would be what is now the F-35. Oh, it's not stealth, but it's everything else. Yeah. And in the meantime, of course, he had an upgraded version of the Harrier for a subsonic Harrier, and the British government wouldn't pay for that. So McDonnell Douglas got the task of developing that for the Marine Corps, because the Marines were going to be by far the biggest buyer. And so BAE and McDonnell Douglas put together the Harrier 2. So this is twice the range or twice the payload, mostly because of the carbon fibre wings and tail, and quite a lot of uprated engine and quite a lot of other features. But it's actually slower than the original Harrier, but it's higher range and payload, or payload. So he finds himself going backwards and forwards to the States, and falling asleep on his way home. He gets the Royal Society Mullard Medal jointly with John Fossard, who had been the chief designer Harrier after Ralph got promoted. Fossard took over the Harrier, and then gets the highest of all awards, the Royal Aeronautical Society Gold Medal, of which there's at most one issued a year, and not every year. So he was recognised for what he achieved. So the McDonnell Douglas BAE AV-8Bs went into Marine Corps service, and the RAF bought them as GR5s. 50-50. There was 50% of the work done in the UK, 50% in the States. That includes the engine, which of course was built by now, Pegasus by Rolls-Royce, because Rolls-Royce had bought Bristol. But 50-50, and assembled in both countries. So parts crossed across the Atlantic. So the RAF ones were built in Kingston, with parts, some local and some from America. And there is Ralph with a model of the 1216, which the British Aerospace Board rejected in favour of going multinational with the Eurofighter. They said, we can't afford to develop an aircraft in this country anymore. We have to be working with at least 2 other countries to share the cost. And went with the Eurofighter Typhoon, at which point Ralph fell out very strongly with the British Aerospace Board and retired early. So he's 59 when he retired. This is a retirement party with lots of good chums, and this is having a good laugh with his secretaries, who presented him with a laptop. He'd never ever used a computer and never did. He never actually ran this laptop. He didn't have a television either, by the way. Listened to the radio all the time. Very proud of the photograph of the Hawk, and that happens to be a 2-seat Harrier signed by all of the test pilots. And that was on his wall in his home till his last days. Retirement parties, more retirement dinners, and this is quite fun. This is the special dinner with the directors of British Aerospace, where they've gagged Ralph to stop him interrupting the speech, so that they knew he was up for a bit of fun. And this, I think, is the reason why I said on the front he's a genius, because I have this from Bill Bedford to Ralph Hooper: without whose creative genius it would never have happened. Thanks for everything, Ralph. Best wishes, Bill Bedford. Bill was there, he knew. He did the very first hover. He knew how important Ralph's input was to this airplane. The RAF 2s entered service in '89, Harrier 2s, and of course are used all around the world. Amazingly, the American Navy, with British Aerospace and McDonnell Douglas, developed a Hawk as a Top Gun trainer for catapult launching and aircraft carrier landing, and they're still in use as the US Navy's basic trainer for aircraft carrier pilots. Extraordinary. They didn't build an American thing. Ralph said it was over-engineered, by the way, because he wasn't responsible for it. Terribly over-engineered. They didn't need that sort of undercarriage. And he was at the last lunch when the British Aerospace closed down the factory in Kingston. And that same year, they bought back and refurbished the Kite 2B, I've got a picture there of the air brakes at the bottom, but you can't see it, but you've seen them before. And there he is with Frank Irvine and Bill Tonkin. People some of you surely know, or did know. Is that the hangar here? Yeah, it's the old hangar, isn't it? Dunstable, perhaps?
Yes.
So they took it to Dunstable on the trailer. And back here, so that's Frank Irvine, isn't it? Yeah. Ralph on the wingtip, I think, possibly. 25 years Harrier celebration. The company had him back to have a bit of a treat. 21 years Hawk, from the first flight of the Hawk, had to be there. 35th anniversary of the first P1127 hover. He's there around an early aircraft, and to the left of the serial number there is his chum from Bristol Engines, Gordon Lewis. Oh, there's a picture of him and Gordon. I didn't mention it, but there was a French patent for a gyropter, which Gordon Lewis had seen, and the Bristol Engines did buy it from, or bought access to the patent, Vibo. But basically, it was a jet engine driving a gearbox with shafts to 4 rotating nozzles on the side of the aircraft, but they were fans. They weren't nozzles with jet from the jet E-flex, they were just fans. So you're carrying all this weight around of all these gearboxes and fans, rather than just putting nozzles on the outlets of the jet engine. But you know, they still recognise that it was the thing that that Gordon Lewis's boss passed to him and said, can we do anything with this? And that's where it all started. First students at Cranfield, and then of course Harriers out in Kosovo and Afghanistan and the Second Gulf War. And then of course in 2010 David Cameron said that we can't afford our Harriers anymore and we'll take them all out of service, and the US Marine Corps promptly bought all 70 odd of the RAF's Harriers. Mainly to use as spares, it has to be said, but they bought them for peanuts. And that's the flyby on the last day. Quite a nice picture. Final salute of RAF Harriers. And we're nearly there. So 2011, this photograph's dated back here. So you'll recognise Wally and a few others. Wally Kahn, Frank Irvine there somewhere, yeah. People like that, and Ralph standing up on the right. Picture of him with one of the Hawker directors. I just like it because it shows he was up for a bit of fun. So they were sort of copycatting each other with their legs and ice creams. I suppose I had to show a picture of me with him. It's me on the left, but that's him in the middle. We actually got him to hold up a 3-view drawing of a Harrier. He was very reluctant. Oh, I don't want to do that. That's my exhibition at the back there on the history of Kingston Aviation. And he came along to it, and we did that. And then he came, oh yes, this is the last picture I have, 2014, of him with the gliding people. So it's Wally, isn't it, in the middle? And I've got the name somewhere. Okay, so he kept that up through his whole life. I mean, in 2014, he's now whatever he is, old. Well, was he born 26? Yeah. So yeah, late 80s. And when I put up some stainless steel panels on a brick column near where the factory had been, which had, the Ham factory had been where the Hunters, Harriers and Hawks were all built, he came along to that. And so these are just last minute photographs, the latest photographs I have of him while he was still well enough. So that's us in an exhibition in the local library after unveiling those plaques with a couple of local councillors from Richmond and Kingston Council. And this is the last photo I have of him, really. It was on that day, and it just totally reminds me of him with a twinkle in his eyes and about to crack a very funny joke, trying to keep a straight face. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Gone on far too long, but I'll take questions.
Yes, are there any quick questions?
It's not a question, but something about, you said earlier, said everything was done by a team. A few years back, I sat down at a table over in the clubhouse where Wadi Khan was holding court.
Right.
And he said, "Do you know this chap?" I said, "Yes." He said, "It's Ralph Hooper." He said, "Yes." "The designer of the Harrier." I said, "Oh, Wadi. He was the leader of the design team. It's a far more difficult job. You have to have the vision and the ability to get all these people together to design something much bigger than any one person." And Wadi said, "You don't know what you're talking about."
Well, Wally was wrong.
Ralph said to me, "Would you like one of these?"
Oh, right, great.
A little gold Harrier.
Yes, yeah, it's a little type-in type thing. Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, Ralph was very self-effacing and always said that. But you just can't deny that no one else had the foresight. I mean, people were spending millions of pounds on all sorts of other ways of vertical takeoff, and he just had this complete simple vision. And he and Gordon, the key thing was they really got on through the whole of their lives, and they didn't tell their bosses how much time they were spending on it. They were spending most of their time on it when they were supposed to be doing other things.
Well, thank you very much again.
You're very welcome. If anybody's really, there's some obituaries and things here, and if anybody's very interested in Kingston Aviation, I've got a few of our brochures, but basically I run the Kingston Aviation Centenary Project. So we're really celebrating 100 years. In 2012, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the first aircraft built in Kingston in 1912 by Sopwith. And we took over Kingston Marketplace and bought in a Camel and Hunter and Harrier cockpits and all sorts of stuff, and an art exhibition and all that. And since then, I've been researching the history of Sopwith in particular. So I've done a week-by-week history of Sopwith through the First World War, what was going on, which is all on our website, which is just Kingston Aviation, www.kingstonaviation.org. So just Google Kingston Aviation, all one word, and it's all up there. There's hundreds of photographs of the First World War Sopwith. But there's also the whole history of the aircraft industry in Kingston. And this is just a bit of a summary. Don't take these if you're going to throw them away, because I'm running out of them. But if you're going to show it to someone or use it, but it basically covers all the key airplanes from Kingston, and some paintings we had done of some of the factories and aircraft. So thank you very much for inviting me. I've enjoyed being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.